like, and make sure to engage in comments and share this video to your friends and story lovers, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifex for more real horror stories like this. Never trust the silence in an old apartment building. That was the first thing Nate thought when he moved into the Maplewood complex. It was one of those places that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The faded green paint on the walls was peeling, and the dim, flickering lights in the hallway gave everything a sickly glow. Most of the units were empty. Nate had counted maybe 3 other tenants in the entire place, but even they seemed like ghosts, always coming and going at odd hours, faces buried in scarves or hoodies, never making eye contact. It wasn't the kind of place you stayed in long. But for Nate, it was all he could afford, and that was reason enough to call it home. The first time he heard it, he thought it was just his imagination. It was around 2 a.m., and he was lying on the thin, lumpy mattress in his room. The wind outside howled through the broken seals of the windows, and the radiator groaned every few minutes like it was alive. He was almost asleep when the sound cut through the static noise of the building. A child's cry. Faint, but unmistakable. His eyes snapped open, and his heart thudded against his ribs. He sat up, straining to hear over the whistling wind. There it was again, softer this time, but clear enough to make his skin crawl. It was coming from below. Nate shook his head, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a TV left on in one of the other apartments, or maybe one of the neighbors had kids, though he hadn't seen any sign of them. Still, the sound of a child crying in the middle of the night, that wasn't something you just ignored. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, stepping into the hallway. The building was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the last person left in the world. He crept down the creaky wooden stairs, following the sound as it grew louder, more desperate. By the time he reached the basement door, his heart was pounding in his ears. The basement was off limits. There was a padlock on the door with a rusted chain that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. A yellowed sign taped to the door read, "Authorized personnel only." But as Nate stood there, the crying stopped. The silence pressed against him, heavy and suffocating. He turned to leave, convinced that he must have imagined it. That's when he heard the faintest whisper, like a breath against his ear. "Help us." He froze. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees, and his flashlight flickered. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking. No response. Just the low hum of the building settling. He didn't sleep that night. The crying, the whisper, it all felt too real to be a figment of his imagination. The next day, Nate tried to push it out of his mind. He went about his usual routine. Work, dinner, scrolling aimlessly on his phone. But the sound haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he could hear it. By the third night, the crying was back. Louder this time, almost frantic. It echoed through the walls, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And always, it led him back to the basement door. That night, as he stood in front of the door again, he made up his mind. He couldn't keep ignoring it. If someone was trapped down there, if a child needed help, he couldn't just do nothing. He grabbed a pair of bolt cutters from the maintenance closet and snapped the chain. The door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase that descended into darkness. The smell hit him first, a rancid mix of mildew and something metallic like old blood. He gagged, but pressed on, his flashlight barely cutting through the thick shadows. The basement was massive, far larger than he'd expected. The walls were lined with old pipes, and the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, scraps of metal, and piles of rotting wood. But it was the silence that unnerved him the most. He'd expected to hear the crying, the voices, but there was nothing. Just the sound of his own breathing and the crunch of debris under his feet. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A small figure darting behind one of the support beams. He whipped around, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Who's there?" No answer. But he felt it, the weight of eyes watching him. He wasn't alone. Nate's breath quickened as he scanned the darkness, the flashlight beam jittering against the cold concrete walls. He couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. It felt tangible, heavy, like the air itself was thick with unseen eyes. He swallowed hard and forced himself to take a step forward, even though every nerve in his body screamed at him to turn back. "Hello?" His voice cracked, echoing back at him in distorted fragments. "If someone's down here, just come out. I'm not here to hurt you." Silence. And then a giggle. A faint, high-pitched sound that sent a chill racing down his spine. It didn't sound happy, though. It was warped, as if whatever was laughing didn't quite understand what laughter was supposed to sound like. Nate whipped the flashlight toward the source, but the beam caught nothing but shadows, stretching endlessly across the floor. The giggle came again, this time from behind him. He spun around, nearly tripping over a rusted metal pipe. "This isn't funny," he shouted, his voice shaking. "If you're messing with me, just stop." And then he heard it, the crying, the same heart-wrenching sobs he'd heard the nights before. Only now, they weren't distant. They were close, too close. It sounded like it was coming from just around the corner. Nate hesitated, gripping the flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. The logical part of his brain begged him to leave, to run back upstairs and call the police or anyone who might be able to deal with whatever this was. But something deeper, a gnawing sense of responsibility, or maybe just morbid curiosity, kept him rooted to the spot. Slowly, he crept toward the sound. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate with each step. As he turned the corner, his flashlight illuminated a small figure huddled against the wall. It was a child, a little girl, no older than 6. Her long dark hair hung in tangled clumps over her face, and her thin arms were wrapped tightly around her knees. She was wearing a filthy, torn dress, and her bare feet were smeared with grime. "Hey," Nate said softly, lowering himself to her level. "It's okay. I'm here to help." The girl didn't respond. She didn't even look up. Her shoulders shook with each sob, and her fingers clawed at the floor, as if trying to dig her way out. Nate reached out a hand, careful to move slowly. "Are you hurt? Can you tell me your name?" As soon as his fingers brushed her shoulder, she went still. Completely, unnaturally still. Nate froze, his heart thundering in his chest. The air around him felt suddenly suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. The girl lifted her head, and Nate's stomach dropped. Her face was pale, too pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were pitch black, endless voids that seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. Before he could react, the girl let out an ear-piercing scream. It wasn't the scream of a child. It was deeper, guttural, and filled with a rage that didn't belong in something so small. The sound hit Nate like a physical force, knocking him backward. His flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam swinging wildly across the room. When the scream finally stopped, Nate scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving. The girl was gone. The only sign she'd been there at all was a faint smear of dirt where she'd been sitting. Nate grabbed his flashlight and backed away, his mind racing. What had he just seen? What was that thing? He wanted to believe it was just a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, he knew better. As he turned to leave, something cold brushed against his ankle. He looked down and saw a tiny hand, pale and skeletal, reaching out from under a pile of debris. He stumbled back with a yelp, his flashlight catching more movement, more hands, clawing their way out of the rubble, out of the walls, out of the floor. Dozens of them, all impossibly small, their fingers stretching toward him like they were trying to drag him down. Nate didn't think. He ran. His legs burned as he sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. He burst through the basement door and slammed it shut behind him, leaning against it as he tried to catch his breath. The hallway was silent again, but the silence felt different now. It felt alive, pulsing with an unseen energy. He locked the door with the chain he'd broken earlier, his hands trembling so badly it took him 3 tries to get the lock in place. Then he ran back to his apartment, locked his door, and sank to the floor. His mind was racing, replaying everything he'd just seen. The girl, the hands, the voices. It was too much, too real. And as he sat there, trying to convince himself that it was over, he heard it again. A whisper, so soft he almost didn't catch it. "Help us." Nate sat frozen on the floor of his apartment, his back pressed against the door, as if his weight alone could keep whatever was in the basement from reaching him. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. That whisper, "Help us," was etched into his brain, looping over and over. It wasn't just a plea, it was a command, a desperate cry that wouldn't leave him alone. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was all in his head. Maybe the stress of living in an abandoned building, the eerie quiet, and his overactive imagination had finally pushed him over the edge. But even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. The icy grip of those hands, the black voids of the girl's eyes, those weren't things the human mind could fabricate. He glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. Every instinct told him to get out of the building, to leave everything behind and never look back. But then he heard it again, louder this time. "Help us!" The voice sounded different now, like it was layered, multiple children speaking at once. It was coming from the vent in his apartment. Nate's heart pounded as he stared at the metal grate across the room. The voice grew louder, more urgent, as if the children were crawling through the ducts, getting closer. His pulse roared in his ears as he grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the vent. The screws holding it in place were old and rusted. It took only a few yanks to pull the grate free. The air that seeped out was freezing, colder than anything he'd felt in the basement. He leaned forward, shining his flashlight inside. The ducts stretched deep into darkness, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then a face appeared, pale, gaunt, with eyes sunken so far back they were just shadows in the sockets. It stared at him, unmoving, unblinking. Behind it, more faces appeared, one by one, their hollow eyes all fixed on him. Nate stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the vent as the voices rose to a deafening crescendo. "Help us! Help us! Help us!" And then silence. Utter, suffocating silence. The faces were gone, the vent empty once again. Nate's chest heaved as he backed away, his mind racing. But before he could process what had just happened, the lights in his apartment flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The hum of electricity that had always been a comforting constant was gone, replaced by a deep, guttural rumbling that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Suddenly, the door to his apartment slammed open. Nate whipped around, his flashlight cutting through the dark. The hallway outside was lit by a faint, flickering red glow, like a warning light. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the floor beneath him. He hesitated for a split second before stepping into the hall, his instincts warring with his curiosity. The air in the hallway was thick, almost choking. Nate followed the red glow, which seemed to be coming from the end of the corridor. As he moved, he noticed something strange. His surroundings were warping. The walls stretched and twisted, the doors to the other apartments impossibly tall and narrow. It was as if the building itself was alive, reshaping itself to trap him. The glow led him back to the basement door. He stopped in front of it, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The chain he'd fastened earlier was now lying on the floor, broken. A deep, rhythmic pounding echoed from the other side, like the beating of a giant heart. He pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. The basement was no longer a storage space. It was a cavernous pit, the floor replaced by a swirling, black void. The walls dripped with a dark, viscous substance that pulsed like it was alive. And in the center of the void, rising from the darkness, was the girl. Her body hovered inches above the ground, her arms outstretched. Her head was tilted back, and her mouth was open in a silent scream. Around her, the shadows coalesced into forms, small, skeletal children, their empty eyes glowing faintly. They reached for her, their hands clawing at the air, but they couldn't touch her. It was as if some invisible force kept them trapped just out of reach. Nate's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to take a step forward. The girl's head snapped down, and her black eyes locked onto his. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, far too wide for her face. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice a guttural snarl that didn't match her childlike form. The shadows around her began to surge, the children's cries turning into a deafening wail. The room felt like it was collapsing, the walls closing in as the void spread outward, consuming everything in its path. Nate stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows surged toward him, their skeletal hands reaching for his throat. In a last, desperate act, Nate shone his flashlight directly at the girl. The beam hit her face, and she let out a piercing scream that made the entire building tremble. The shadows recoiled, writhing as if in pain. The void began to collapse, pulling the girl and the shadowy forms back into its depths. Nate didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the floor as the walls around him buckled and twisted. He didn't stop until he was outside, gasping for air under the pale glow of the streetlights. The building behind him was silent once more, its windows dark and lifeless. But as he stared at it, catching his breath, he saw a figure in one of the basement windows. The girl. She was smiling at him, her black eyes gleaming in the dark. Nate didn't go back. He didn't even bother to pack his things. He left the city that night, driving as far as his car would take him. But even now, miles away, he can still hear them, the faint, pleading voices of the children. Help us. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifacts for more real and true stories like this.